The first thing I guess I wanted to say is that when I was getting ready to come up here this morning, I was trying to figure out what I should be wearing. Normally, when I give talks like this at colleges, universities, or at societies, and so I'll wear a Hawaiian shirt because I grew up on Maui, where Patsy Mink was my congresswoman. But then I realized I was coming to Harvard, and I realized that I was going to come at the invitation of Joan, of Dr. Reed. And that somehow made me think a little bit differently because, you know, whether you like it or not, whether you realize it or not, people on the outside really pay attention to what Harvard does and what Harvard says. So I don't mean any disrespect by dressing this way. But I did just want to say, and I think that that's perhaps the first point I wanted to make, that I'm so glad that you all are here for the work that you're doing today and tomorrow, as well as to celebrate the 25 years of the work that this office, that this group, that this university, that this medical school has been doing on behalf of diversity and inclusion. As I said, you may not think that it matters, but people on the outside pay a whole lot of attention to what Harvard does. You have the opportunity to lead by example. And so I don't say that lightly at all. The second thing I wanted to say is I was really moved to listen to this morning's three presentations, the two speakers and then the panel. Because everybody was telling us their personal story. And I guess I just wanted to also acknowledge that although I don't believe I've ever been to Harvard Medical School before, this place or this area has strong roots for my family. My father, about 70 years ago, was a seminary student at Andover Newton Seminary, or theological school, outside, it's Newton, you know, outside of Boston. And he was there, not because he necessarily had planned to be there, but because that was what society had let him be. My father was raised, he was Japanese American. He was born in 1914, he died in 2014, so he lived almost 100 years. He almost saw his 100th birthday. He went to Berkeley, he got a bachelor's degree in business in 1939, so he was a little bit older. He was 25 years old when he got his bachelor's degree. Back today, we would say that he was a transfer student because he went to Compton JC first. He was a first-generation student because he was the first in his family to have even graduated from high school. So anyway, he had this bachelor's degree in business from Berkeley in 1939. There was no work for him, partly because of the economy and partly because of his race. And so he worked as a gardener in Long Beach. His mother and his sister and he lived on Terminal Island, which is a place in the middle of Los Angeles Harbor. My grandmother, his mother, ran a dry goods store for the fisher persons that worked there. Everything changed, of course, in 1941 when World War II came. And so my family, my father, his sister, and their mother, together with about 3,000 Japanese Americans who were living on Terminal Island, together with about 120,000 Japanese Americans who were living on the West Coast, 2/3 of them were US citizens because of their birth, were put into concentration camps all over sort of the desert part of the United States. My father's family went to a place called Poston, which is right on the border between Arizona and California. Then and now it is a reservation, actually, for the Colorado River Indians. And so when he was in camp, my father then decided, well, you know, this business thing didn't work out too well. And he couldn't be a gardener. And there wasn't any fishing going on. And so he thought, well, what am I going to do? And so he eventually decided that he was going to become a Christian minister. He was brought up Buddhist, but he decided he was going to become a Christian minister. And so in order to do that, he first went to Albion, Michigan, where he was a janitor at the Star Commonwealth for Boys. And then he moved to Buffalo. And eventually then he came to Newton to come to seminary here. Not necessarily because this was the only seminary that he chose, but rather this was about the only seminary that would take him. He then was graduated. He was ordained a congregational minister. And so he has deep roots in New England. If you know anything about the Congregational Church, and you all should because you all live in Boston, then the Congregational Church is so called because it's the congregation that gets to decide things. There's no hierarchy, there's no bishops, and so forth. And so if a congregation is large and rich, they can afford a minister that's rich and large. If they're not so large or rich, they basically hire whomever they can get. And so my father spent all of his career then serving small churches, places that couldn't afford any better. So he served churches in New England, in Vermont. This is when I joined the family. We then moved to a little town in Kansas. And in Vermont and Kansas, we were the only non-whites in the town, the only non-whites in school, and certainly some of the few non-whites in the county. And then eventually we moved to Maui when I was in the 6th grade. And there it was a big change, right? Because now I was in the majority. There was only one haole in my whole class. And so this was just part of my thing. I'm not telling you that because there's anything particularly special, because all of us in this room have our own stories. All of us know this. There's nothing particularly unusual about my father's story, except that I just wanted to make the point, which is, I think, again, something that we all understand, which is that for my father, as well as for many of us, race mattered. Race determined pretty much everything he could do for his whole life. It determined where he could go to school, what kind of profession he could take, where he had to live, how he raised and where he raised his 2 sons. So race matters also, of course, for those of us who are interested in advancing science. I don't think I need to tell this audience about why diversity is so important. When I'm at other kinds of places, when maybe there are people who haven't thought about it as much as you have, perhaps I have to spend 10 minutes or so arguing about why diversity is a real asset for science. In fact, we can't do excellence in science without a diverse group of scientists. Scott Page shows us that when the problems are difficult, and that's science, then the problems are better solved when the group of problem solvers are diverse. In fact, the harder the problem, the better the benefit of a diverse group of problem solvers. That makes sense, right? Because what you need are different perspectives. You need different ways of looking at the data. You need different tools to analyze the stuff. Further, other folks have shown us that when you have a group that's too homogeneous, they tend to have what's called convergent thinking. If I were giving a different talk, I would show you the video. Remember of Lucy and Ethel? You know this video, this old TV show, I Love Lucy, where they're doing the candy thing? You remember the chocolate thing? So you can Google that. Google Lucy and Ethel chocolate, and you get a gazillion different YouTube things. And it's hilarious, because you got these 2 women who are in this candy factory, and they're supposed to be doing stuff. Well, convergent thinking works really well in a factory, in an assembly line, because I do my thing, and then she does her thing, and then this next person does their thing. And as long as we're all doing what we're supposed to do, then the thing works. Divergent thinking is when we're getting too creative, we're getting too innovative. And so I don't do my job, and therefore the next person can't do her job, and so forth. So if you remember this video, you know that you've got Lucy and Ethel who are put into a situation where they're just not going to be able to play the game. And as a result, things go to heck pretty quickly. So my point is that science is the kind of a field that, first of all, depends on groups, and diversity is a property of a group. So we do things in groups, right? We have lab groups, we have departments, we have universities and medical schools. We go to panels, we have study sections, we belong to professional societies. These are all groups. So we depend on groups. Second, science is about trying to solve hard problems. And so it's important for us to bring in divergent kinds of thinking, because that's where innovation and creativity come in. So the opportunity for diversity is high, and you all know this. I was thinking about 25 years of this program, and so I went on the online, and I assume most of this is sort of true. In 1990, the inflation rate in the United States was 5.4%. Today, the inflation rate is 0.1%. In 1990, the interest rates for the Federal Reserve were about 10%. Today, they are between 0.25 and 0.5%. And so those are examples where things have changed a whole bunch in 25 years. Another thing that if you look at 1990 versus 2015, some things don't change, because in fact, it was in 1990 that the United States first began its conflicts in Iraq. We're still there. It was in 1990 that the world decided that they were going to ban ivory trade, and we're still there. So some things change a lot, some things don't. The population also changes, and this is where our opportunity comes in, because if you agree that diversity is an asset, it is something that we need to be able to have amongst our scientists, well, we've got a hell of an opportunity all around us. We don't have to work very hard to find diversity in this country. In 1990, the US population was about 250 million. Today, it is about 320 million. All of that growth, all 70 million difference in those 25 years is because of people of color. So people of color in this country have grown from about 50 million in 1990 to 120 million, or 37% of our US population today. So that's an opportunity. It's all around us. Those of us who think about education, we should say, wow, this is not going to be hard, because everything's... The problem is, and this is our challenge in diversity, in the scientific community, in our institution, we haven't taken advantage of that opportunity. The US population today, besides being about 37% persons of color, is about 30 or so, a little bit more than 30% underrepresented minorities. African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. Yet the scientific workforce is on the order of 9% underrepresented minorities. And the faculty, the tenure-track faculty in the science disciplines, including Harvard Medical School, is something lower than 6% underrepresented minorities. So we've got this opportunity to do better science, and yet we haven't yet captured that talent pool. Now, some might say, well, you know, that's okay. We don't have to do the best science. We can do sort of okay science. Harvard would not say that, right? But other schools would say that. And that's fine, except that we also have to understand that this is an existential argument for us. It's not just whether we want to do the best science or not. If we don't involve the entire talent pool available to us as scientists, then we are a discipline without a future. Because you know that the population in this country is rapidly changing, so that in 25 years from now, the US population will have flipped to majority minority. We don't have to wait another generation. We don't have to wait 25 years. Because in fact, last year, the school kids in public schools, the K through 12, that population, the entering kids, are now majority minority. And so it's already coming. So that's our opportunity as well as our challenge. Now, when we think about this, it's useful, I think, to think a little bit more about numbers. In those 25 years that this office has existed at Harvard, the US has made some progress in terms of preparing underrepresented minorities in science. And one measure is the PhDs that we are producing as a country who are underrepresented minorities. That difference, that progress has been slow, but it is a positive slope. So I'm going to draw a graph for you, okay? So you got to put down your sandwiches for a moment. So here's a graph. There's a y-axis is here, and that y-axis is the percentage of underrepresented minorities in a particular population. On the x-axis is time in years. 9% of our PhDs today, in 2015, 2016, are underrepresented minorities, 9% of our science PhDs. 25 years ago, that number was on the order of 5%. So you go from 5% to 9%, so there's a line here. You see it? It's red. You see the red line? And it's moving up. That's good. That's a positive slope. But the question is then, what would parity look like, right? What would the what would the percentage of minority PhDs have to be in order for us to reach parity with the US population? Well, the US population today is about 30% underrepresented minorities. So on my graph, I'm going to draw a dotted line at 30. See it? Going all the way across. So I got this red line over here, 2015, 25 years ago. How long is it going to take at our current rate for this line to intersect that dotted line? And the answer is over a century. But that's not the bad news, because or the good news, I guess, the opportunity, is because that dotted line is false. That dotted line it's not going to stay at 30%. In fact, in a generation, it'll be way up here. And so, in fact, that straight line that we see here, even though it's going to take us a century to intersect with the dotted line where it is now, that dotted line ain't going to be there in 100 years. So that line, that curve, has to somehow look like this. And so that's why I suggested that today's topic would be on a nonlinear approach to diversity. I'm going to suggest that all of the things that we've done as a country, all of the billions of dollars that we have spent have been important, have been effective, but they're not fast enough. And so for those of you that are molecular biologists, you know that when you're trying to amplify something at a nonlinear rate, when you're trying to get an exponential amplification, you can use something like polymerase chain reaction. So polymerase chain reaction would do that. But that's the problem with that analogy is that polymerase chain reaction simply amplifies the same template over and over again. So what we really need are a way of creating new primers so that we can get this amplification, but the stuff that we're amplifying is everybody, not just the same old. So I want to spend the rest of my time today talking with you about three sort of things that I think an institution, a university, a medical school, a Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Three things that I think we need to think about. And I'm putting these in the context of sort of mistakes that we make, even those of us who really want to do this. I have 3 E's. My list is 3 E's. The first E is excellence, the second E is evidence, and the third E is eagerness to fix the symptoms, to fix the problem. So the first E, excellence. What we do, I think this is a mistake, because we too often define excellence as exclusionary. So we talked about this morning, right? We talked about how it's easy, really, to look at an applicant, whether she's applying to undergraduate or graduate or an MD program. You can look at her test scores. When Howard Hughes looks at prospective investigators, we can look at their past records. It doesn't take a real genius to figure out who's got the scores, who's got the grades, who's got the awards and the papers and all. But that's what they've done. That's their accomplishments, and those are important. And that might be a prediction for future success, but it is not the same as measuring their future success. And so the first thing that I think we need to do as a group, as a culture, is to redefine what we think about as excellence. I think it's harder because, in fact, the reason historically that we've gone to things like GRE scores, MCAT scores, SAT scores, whatever those things are, is because they give us the sense that they're objective, and that so it sort of avoids being prejudiced, right? Because if I just compare my score to Shirley's score, then we can just get a quantitative measure. And I understand the notion. I understand, I think, the reasoning behind that. But we know that there's a lot more than that. In fact, what do we value in science the most? What we value in science are persons who are resilient, who have grit, who are persistent, who are also able to look at things a little bit differently. And there isn't a really good standardized test for that yet. So one of our challenges is to come up with a way to measure that. I don't know how to measure it, but I do know that one of the things that we've been trying to do at Hughes is to offer lots of students at a very early age the opportunity to do real research. So if you think about research, now think about a long time ago when you were undergraduates, Some of you, not as long as me, but when we were all undergraduates, many of us went into science, or in high school. I did the same high school program that Lydia talked about. When we were when we were younger, we would get exposed to doing research, and this often turned us into scientists. Well, typically what happens at the undergraduate level is that these are expensive sort of things, right? Because you use up a lot of time. Usually it's an apprenticeship kind of a thing where the individual student works with a faculty member, so you only have so many faculty members who can do this. You only have so much capacity. Usually you have to pay students during the summertime. And so really those kinds of apprenticeship-based models are often based on selection. And they usually happen later in the student's career, maybe as a junior or even as a senior. And so because they're expensive, because there's selection, because there's prerequisites, you only select a few who can do it, and you leave out a whole bunch of other folks. So if there are ways for us to involve younger students, freshmen, who don't have the prerequisites, they've never had any classes, they walk in as freshmen, and if you can do it at a scale so that thousands of students can do it at the same time, and if they are doing sciences that actually makes sense, that is actually authentic, I use the word authentic research, then this is an opportunity for us to instead of sort of selecting the few, to letting everybody in and then let them explore their own potential. And so we have a couple of programs. I don't have time to talk about it today, but I think that's one of the strategies that we need to think about. I think Harvard Medical School should be thinking about that. Even though you're working with students who perhaps are no longer undergraduates, you still have an opportunity to show young people what research can really be about, not because of their past accomplishments, not because of their GRE scores or their SAT scores or their MCAT scores, but because you're trying to figure out who has the potential, who has the grit, the determination, just sort of the way of thinking about it as a scientist that it's hard to measure. And the other challenge, as I said earlier, is I think it's also important for us, for you, to figure out ways to actually measure potential, to figure out ways of measuring persistence so that it can be a score almost, just like an SAT score is. All right, my second E was evidence. We're all scientists. And this is interesting, and I'm sure our colleagues have had many more experiences than I. I know Joan's scholarship, part of her scholarship is to look at networks. I'm going to be talking about publications, which is a different measure, but I think also very interesting. So when we talk with scientists about the importance of diversity, scientists say, well, I'm a scientist. And so you have to show me the evidence. Because I'm objective, right? Just as Lydia was saying, I just look at the data, right? But even when we are confronted with the data that we don't like, we selectively choose to either accept it or not. The Ross-Makusin paper was published in PNAS a few years ago now that showed the implicit bias in terms of gender that Lydia referred to amongst us scientists at top universities. That wasn't the first of these Goldberg kind of experiments. There have been gazillions of them, from orchestras to IT manager applications to foreign versus all kinds of stuff in the academy as well as not. It's always there, and yet when I talk with faculty, it's usually, well, not usually, I hope it's not usually, but often is the case that they'll say, well, I'm a scientist, I'm objective, I don't have implicit bias. All right. I think that's partly because we wrap that into feeling guilty about something, and that's not the point of implicit bias training. The point is that we all have biases. We're not going to fix that. We just have to understand that that's one of the ways that how we operate through this world. And so I think it's important, I think it's incumbent on all of us to expect us, our colleagues, to look at the evidence and then to ask folks, okay, what does this data mean? And I want to give you an example. Joan mentioned that one of the programs that we run is called the Gilliam Graduate Fellowships. This is a PhD fellowship program that HHMI funds. We have some at Harvard, some Gilliam Fellows at Harvard. So what we've been doing recently with our Gilliam Fellows is that we've been bringing the mentors, the PIs, the lab heads, the advisors to HHMI for a day-and-a-half mentor training. Angela Byers-Winston and Chris Fund at Wisconsin do this training. And it's great because it gets us to think about how you mentor across differences. Because I told you, right, that less than 6% of our faculty are underrepresented minorities. And yet these programs that involve underrepresented minorities as fellows, the odds are really high that I'm not going to look like my student, my mentee. So how do I get better at this? So anyway, what we did was we asked our mentors this year to go back to their graduate programs and to ask, of all of their PhD students that they have, tell us about who's publishing what. All right? So we went back to all of these schools. We ended up with data that represented 928 PhD students that were coming from all these different programs. These are the best programs in the country. These aren't no slouches. These are the Harvards, as well as some of the schools that are almost as good as Harvard, all around the country. Publics and privates. These are all biomedical graduate student programs. T32 training grant funded programs. That's part of the criteria for getting into the Gilliam program. And so we asked them, all right, so of your students, how many of them published a paper, a peer-reviewed paper, based on their PhD work? And of those, how many of them were first authors? That is, the student was a first author on her own research. Okay, you got it? So that's a fairly simple assay, fairly simple survey. So the first thing that I should just note is that about a third of our folks couldn't get the data. So it's hard for them to get the data. But for those that we did, as I said, we got 928 data on 928 students. And I want to just show you just one bit of it. So if you look at it, we've got by category, all students. The total was 928. 454 were women. And underrepresented minorities are 112, which is about 12% of that population, which is about the national average in terms of the underrepresented minorities who are in PhD programs across the country. So we asked them various kinds of things, but look at the one in red. I just took the data and we asked, so of these students, how many of these students published their PhD work as a first author? So what you see is for all students, it was about 70%. For women, it was about 70%. But for underrepresented minorities, it was 39%. This is data that's very similar to what Mike Nettles published several years ago in his book, The Three Magic Letters. I'm not aware of too much other data like this. And we're not pretending that this is a comprehensive study of all graduate programs. This is just what we were able to get. So I'm asking you what we asked the mentors. Here's the data, right? So you get the point. The point is that underrepresented minorities are publishing at almost half the rate of all students in terms of being first authors on their graduate work coming out of these programs. So those are the data. That's the evidence. What hypotheses does this derive? This is the scientific process, right? You do some discovery, you get some data, then you figure out a hypothesis, then you go out and you test it. So we asked our mentors, so what's the hypothesis? So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I've been doing this around the country, and I get interesting answers. So it's okay. By the way, I don't know the answer. I don't know why it is. I'm interested in knowing what you think the reason is. Oh, come on. This is Harvard. Yes?
So here you're talking about people who did get the data and had the data, but were in the paper not as first authors, but somewhere else in the middle? Is that this group?
Say again?
So this group is the group who did have the data, not the group.
Yep. These are the people who could report.
Yeah. Well, one of it may be that at the beginning of the project, there wasn't an open discussion of who was going to do what and what the order of authors was going to be, and so on.
Okay. That's fine. Another hypothesis. Yes, sir.
It could be a manifestation of one's feeling insecure about writing.
So the student might feel insecure about writing, for example. Okay. That's fine. That's another hypothesis. Another hypothesis.
That this minority or female students who weren't first author were judged by their mentor and perhaps by themselves as having needed more help and therefore hadn't really done the most work, even though it was their work, but belonged someplace else.
So there was some sort of a differential view of the contributions, perhaps, or of the independence of the student. One more. This is fine. Yes?
Perhaps the perhaps the students didn't realize that they needed to have a discussion before the project began.
So the students didn't realize that if you don't publish in this business, you have no future in this business. All right, so when we asked our mentors this, we got similar kinds of hypotheses. One guy said, well, you just didn't do the study right. Okay, fine, maybe not. It was interesting, though, that a few people said, maybe this isn't about the students' deficiencies. Maybe this is the mentor's or the institution's responsibility, whether telling them the expectation that you better publish, or an expectation that we would have which would be manifesting an implicit bias. And one of our investigators, she happens to work at MIT, so she's pretty good, said, I wonder if this isn't because we tend to give the most exciting projects to some of our students, and maybe others we don't, because we have a differential expectation of our students. So my point is not that I know the reason for this disparity. My suggestion to you is that you also could ask the same question of your graduate programs. I don't know how many different graduate programs there are at Harvard Med, but there must be several. I'm aware of some of them. I know that some of them, anyway, are interdepartmental. They're pretty large. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to ask, just get these data. First of all, find out how much of the data you can actually get. And then second, just ask this. And then, just as we tried to do with you and what we tried to do with our mentors, to ask folks, okay, well, whatever the data are for Harvard, here are your numbers. Why do we think this might be? So that leads me then to my third and final E, which has to do with eagerness to solve, or eagerness to fix the symptoms without perhaps finding the cure. When faculty, when administrators, when folks who care about diversity, and lots of people do, we're no longer in an era where we have to argue that this is important. Lots of people do. There is a tendency by us, because we are scientists, to say, okay, tell me the problem, we're going to go out, we're going to solve the problem. We're going to just solve it, we're just solve it. And sometimes that eagerness gets in the way and leads us down what I would consider to be the wrong direction, or maybe not such a good direction. And one of the main things that we do in our discipline, in our country, is that we often tend to blame the victims. We fix the students. We say, that student didn't come in with the same background, didn't have the same preparation, she's not as prepared, and so maybe we'll give her some remedial work, but it's not my fault, right? It's not my responsibility. So part of this discussion, and this is the hard part, and we are running an initiative right now at the undergraduate level called Inclusive Excellence, which is asking colleges and universities to think not about how they would fix the student, but rather how they would address the challenges at the institutional level. How can the institution change its capacity for inclusion? That's a lot harder. Because whenever you write a grant proposal, you immediately say, well, I got 20 students, I want to give them a research experience. We're going to give them a research experience, you give us some money, we're going to pay the stipends, da-da-da-da-da. But when the grant is over, you no longer can support 20 students, and the institution hasn't changed a whole lot, usually. So the challenge that we are trying to put to the undergraduate level, but I would put to any level, including a medical school, for example, is what can the institution do to change its capacity so that it is a more inclusive place? And here's just a couple of things that come to my mind. Maybe, I'm sure you can come up with better ideas. One of the things that we talked about this morning was the fact that we all have biases. Lydia talked about stereotype threat. We have privilege. There are intentional training programs for faculty and administrators to learn about unintended bias, to learn about privilege, stereotype threat, how to listen to understand. I think an example of an institutional capacity changer is to ask, expect, as part of the leadership development of a faculty, for this kind of intentional training. I don't know about you all, but when I went to graduate school or when I was a postdoc, we weren't trained in this sort of stuff. We weren't trained how to teach. We were not shown those kinds of skills. And yet, when we needed a skill, we'd go out and get it. So when I was a postdoc, I realized I needed to learn how to make monoclonal antibodies. My lab didn't make monoclonal antibodies, so I went off and I spent 2 weeks at a colleague's lab down at USC Medical School to learn how to make monoclonals. That changed my career. That was a skill that I just needed to know. I needed to put 2 weeks in, and it really was valuable to me. So I would suggest that the same thing can happen amongst the faculty. And I'm not diminishing this. I'm not minimizing this. I really think this is important because I think that's the nonlinear approach. I think the nonlinear approach is instead of just trying to fix each student one by one, which is important, it's very important, that's not enough. We've got to do this. And to do this, what that means is that those of us who work here have to get better at thinking about inclusion. I'll say one more thing about that, because when I talk about these things to faculty, they often say, well, you know, it's that old generation, and as soon as we get out of the way, the younger folks are going to come up and they understand diversity, David, don't you worry. Well, unless a school is completely turning over its faculty 100% in 1 year, that's very difficult. And plus, numerous studies have shown that when you hire in even the most idealistic, terrific young faculty into a bigger place, they immediately have to become co-opted into that culture of that place. So it's on us. It's on us who are 94% whites and Asians to learn how to work with those students who are soon going to be 50% underrepresented minorities coming into our classroom. We can't wait for the next generation. Yes, the next generation is important, but that's not sufficient. So that's the difference, in my view, between a linear and a nonlinear approach. So the last thing I wanted to just leave with you are just a couple of things. I wanted to leave with you a couple of ideas which are not a long-term solution. They are short-term gaps, but they are things that I just wanted to make you aware of. The first is that a program that we're about to launch at Hughes called the Hannah Gray Fellowships. So these are programs, this is a program aimed at beginning postdocs to support a postdoc all the way through her postdoc time and then her assistant professor time, essentially. And this is aimed specifically at folks who are underrepresented in the academic sciences. So that includes women, underrepresented ethnic and racial minorities, persons from other disadvantaged backgrounds. I got this slide from our folks in science who run this thing, so I'm just showing you their slide, but I guess it shows you the number of dollars that a person might get. But the point is that a person can be supported for up to 8 years, 4 years as a postdoc, and then up to 4 years as an independent faculty person. And the reason, of course, is that this isn't going to change the face of the faculty. Right? Let's not pretend that this is a nonlinear approach to inclusion. But this is a small model that we hope others will pay attention to, and we hope that a few people will actually benefit and take advantage of this. Here's a little bit more information. We're going to announce this in September of this year. You have to be a PhD or an MD, and with less than 1 year of postdoctoral experience when you apply. And as I said, it is aimed at persons who belong to groups that are underrepresented in academic science. The second thing that I just wanted to mention to you is perhaps a little bit more relevant to a medical school. It occurs to me, looking at national data, that, a large number of underrepresented minority kids, of course, are coming to medical school. In fact, it's far larger than the number who are finishing PhDs in the sciences. Every year, it's about 3,500 underrepresented minorities matriculate to medical school across the country. It's about 19% of all matriculants. The NIH tells us that only about 2% of those folks think that they want to do research in their careers. We know that there's a real need for physician scientists in this country. We know that we need people who can use basic science, laboratory science, to apply that to clinical problems. So it's different than clinical research. I think that's a real opportunity that we, as a country, are not taking full advantage of. So a way of beginning to diversify the scientific workforce, the persons who are teaching, the persons who are the professors, the leadership, is to perhaps pay closer attention to our students who are in medical school, and probably even more, the students who want to go to medical school, the pre-meds, to show them that a suitable, very attractive, terrific opportunity in terms of their career might be, bless you, might be to think about how they can do research as a physician. Howard Hughes has a small program called the Med Fellows. We put about 80 or so students, medical students, a year into a year-out program where they do research. That's a very tiny little drop to the 3,500 kids who are minorities, and that's, by the way, is not, Med Fellows is not just a minority. You know, it's for everybody. So it's not really targeted towards a diverse population of medical students. But I'm just wondering if a place like Harvard might think about what you can do to take advantage of that pool of folks who are already coming in and to make them more aware and more interested in careers in research. So I want to finish then by just reminding us that what I've tried to do is to remind us that diversity is quite different than inclusion. Last year, you know, when all of the riots were, not riots, but all the unrest was happening on campuses, it still is going on, but less so than it was last semester. You know, there were over 100 schools that made it into the news that are part of the demands.org. So you go on the website, and you can read the demands of all of these schools about what they're asking in terms of racial justice on their campuses. A couple things strike me about when I read all these demands from over 100 schools. The pain that's there is incredible. So even if 99% of that is just empty rhetoric, and we know undergraduates tend to be, you know, they like to, even if only 1% of that's real, that's really painful stuff that these folks are telling us. That, to me, is a signal for us that folks don't feel like they belong. And the second thing that I would just point out is that if you look at the list of schools, over 100 schools that had that, they're not just the white schools. There's a lot of schools there that are either minority serving or HBCUs or are private universities that have been able to attract a large number of persons of color into their student body. So it is not just that if you just have a certain number of students who happen to be minorities that you've suddenly solved the problem. If those folks don't feel like they belong, if their inclusion is not part of that equation, then we're wasting our time. And so that's the point that I would make, that inclusion isn't a number. Inclusion is very personal. And so I wanted to end by reading for you a quote that I like to use when I talk about these things. This is by my favorite Supreme Court justice, Justice Sotomayor. She wrote this as a dissenting opinion in one of the University of Michigan cases. This is the case that upheld the earlier case that said that you couldn't use affirmative action at the University of Michigan. So it was a couple of years ago now that she wrote. And she got into trouble for writing this. Then Justice Scalia, for example, really just lambasted her in the press, saying that, you know, how dare a Supreme Court justice talk about emotional things in a commentary that's going to become part of the official record. I found that ironic for Scalia to say that. Anyway, let me read this and then I'll shut up. This is Justice Sotomayor. And it's hard for me sometimes to read this without, well, so I'll try. And race matters for reasons that really are only skin deep. that cannot be discussed any other way and that cannot be wished away. Race matters to a young man's view of society when he spends his teenage years watching others tense up as he passes. Race matters to a young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, "No, where are you really from?" Race matters to a young person addressed by a stranger in a foreign language, which he does not understand because only English was spoken at home. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce that most crippling of thoughts: I do not belong here. Harvard has a real opportunity to lead. And I encourage you to think about how this place can always be thinking about inclusion. Small things, bigger things, everything we do, we should be thinking about inclusion. So I want to thank you, and my last slide just has some of the references that I like to point people to. So thank you.